Totus mundus agit histrionem. All the world's a stage. This is the motto of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, which was founded in 1599, and it was also the motto of its acting company, based on the very first play that was performed in the Globe Theatre, As You Like It. The line taken from Jacques, character Jacques, Act 2, Scene 7, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 stages. This idea of the theater as a microcosm, as it were, of the whole world and the cosmos is the foundation of today's lecture, which is about the idea of a great chain of being. A great chain of being. This great chain of being can be seen on a multitude of levels. I'm going to look primarily at the issue of cosmology as an illustration of this, but I'll talk about how it applies in other areas. As far as the relation of microcosm and macrocosm, about which I will say more in the next lecture, in which I'm going to talk about correspondences. On the macrocosmic level, the big cosmic level, I should say something about the word cosmos. First of all, the word cosmos in Greek, in Latin, mundus means both order on the one hand and also ornament. And it was first used by the Platonists. Now, check that. It was first used by the Pythagoreans as a term for what we would call the universe. And it was simultaneously shaped and bounded, unlike the unharmonious and shapeless chaos that they conceived was the origin of all things. So the word cosmos there is in the word macrocosm. The macrocosmic level is that of what we call cosmology, the so-called book of nature. And within that book of nature, there is a hierarchy, a great chain of being, beginning with the sun and then moving on down through the planets and so on. This is a hierarchy in nature. We will also find that a similar hierarchy is seen to reside within the body politic, that between the king on the one hand and his subjects on the other. This is a social hierarchy. And then thirdly, there's a microcosm of life, and a particular microcosm of the human person, within which we have the reason ruling over the passions and the appetites by means of the will. And this is a moral hierarchy. This notion of a hierarchy is, I think, one aspect of the great chain of being, but this consistency in representing hierarchy is something that is characteristic of the Elizabethan era. And for that matter, it goes into the 17th century. I'm going to read a brief snippet on this, famous in the period. I'm going to see if I can stick it up here on the screen for you. It is an extract, a speech by Ulysses, for those of you who know him better by his Greek name, Odysseus, speaking to Agamemnon, the great king, and also Nestor. So this is a speech that Ulysses gives, and it's on the issue of degree, by which is meant hierarchy. I'll read the whole speech and then I'll comment. Troy, yet upon his basis, had been down, and the great Hector's sword had lacked a master, but for these instances. The specialty of rule hath been neglected. And look how many Grecian tents do stand hollow upon this plain. So many hollow factions. When that the general is not like the hive to whom the forger shall all repair, what honey is expected? Degree being visored, the unworthiest shows as fairly in the mask. The heavens themselves, the planets, and this center observe degree, priority, and place. Insisture, course, proportion, season, form. office and custom in all line of order, and therefore is the glorious planet Sol, in noble eminence enthroned and sphered amidst the other, whose medicinable eye corrects the influence of evil planets and posts, like the commandment of a king, sans check to good and bad. But when the planets in evil mixture to disorder wander, what plagues and what portents, what mutiny, what raging of the sea, shaking of earth, commotion in the winds, frights, changes, horrors, divert and crack, rend and deracinate the unity and married calm of states quite from their fixture. Oh, when degree is shaked, which is the ladder of all high designs, the enterprise is sick. How could communities, degrees in schools and brotherhoods in cities, peaceful commerce from dividable shores, the primogenity and due of birth, prerogative of age, crowns, scepters, laurels, but by degrees stand in authentic place. Take but degree away, untune that string, and hark what discord follows. Each thing meets in mere oppugnancy. The bounded waters should lift their bosoms higher than the shores and make a sop of all this solid globe. Strength should be the lord of imbecility, and the rude son should strike his father dead. Force should be right, or rather right and wrong, between whose endless war justice resides, should lose their names, and so should justice too. Then everything includes itself in power, power into will, will into appetite, and appetite, and universal wolf, so doubly seconded with will and power, must make perforce an universal prey, and last eat up himself. Let me leave off with that. So this great speech given by Ulysses on the matter of degree, you can see the ways in which it plays upon the very sense of the great chain of being and draws the explicit comparison between the book of nature, in which there's a hierarchy governed by Sol, or the sun, over the other planets, which is compared to the body politic, that between a king or a prince and his subjects, and likewise the ruling of the reason over the passions or appetites through the will. If this degree is not recognized, then there can be no justice. This is the great chain of being amplified in three particular ways. And as I said at the outset, the whole world plays the actor. The whole world's a stage. And that stage is not only that of the Elizabethan theater, Shakespeare's theater and the round the globe theater, but of course it also plays itself out in all aspects of life. So the great chain of being is to be seen in these ways. And I am going to emphasize, and this is not an unusual take on that Milton and his age, Shakespeare and his age will take on this. This is the position that has been taken from time immemorial. It's the understanding of Plato's Republic, about which is the focused on the topic of justice. And to illustrate what justice is for an individual, which is his primary concern, he feels the need to make a comparison, namely Plato, to the city-state, the polis. He says it's easier to see justice in the social relations between individuals, but he sees this as an illustration merely of how the reason also rules over the passions or appetites. And this is his the issue that he has with the poets of the day, is that they appeal to the passions and appetites without obeying reason and understanding reason properly, as do the philosophers, for which reason Plato states that the philosophers would rule in his ideal city-state. But let me move away from that. But this is just to say this is not a new way of looking at things. And it was picked up in the ancient world, and it was picked up in the Christian world. And it was done so through a Christianized Aristotelian Ptolemaic cosmology. And it rests upon a fundamental opposition. I spoke about degree, about hierarchy. Here, the opposition is characterized as that residing between the earthly, on the one hand, which is characterized by generation. I mentioned this last time in the book of Genesis. It's the book of beginnings, but also of generations. Generation and corruption are characteristic of the earth. So is flux, so is mutability, so is inconstancy. On the one hand, and on the other hand, the heavenly, which is its antithesis. It is constant, it is orderly, it is eternal. Now, in Aristotle's view, the cosmos had always existed. It was eternal. Now, this was incompatible with the Genesis account of creation and was rejected. But the Platonic myth, which is represented from Plato's Timaeus, let me see if I have that here. Do I have that here? I thought I had it here. There I have it. Let me just put that up on our share screen for you. I'll just read the little bit of an extract and you'll find it helpful here. This is from Plato's Timaeus, section 34. I'm going to skip over the reference to the 7 motions, but the 7 motions we'll see will relate to the 7 spheres. And I'll come to this paragraph here. Such then was the sum of the reasoning of the ever-existing God concerning the God which was one day to be existent, whereby he made it smooth and even and equal on all sides from the center, a whole and perfect body compounded of perfect bodies. And in the midst thereof he set soul, which he stretched throughout the whole of it. And therewith he enveloped also the exterior of its body. And as a circle, revolving in a circle, he established one sole and solitary heaven, able of itself, because of its excellence, to company with itself, and needing none other beside, sufficing unto itself as acquaintance and friend. And because of all this, he generated it to be a blessed God. Now, here comes the microcosm. As regards the soul, although we are essaying to describe it after the body, God did not likewise plan it to be younger than the body, for when uniting them, he would not have permitted the elder to be ruled by the younger. But as for us men, even as we ourselves partake largely of the accidental and casual, so also do our words. God, however, constructed soul to be older than body and prior in birth and excellence, since she was to be the mistress and ruler, and it the ruled, and he made her of the materials. This from Plato's Timaeus. This account of creation is more compatible with Genesis because it did not see the earth as eternal. But there's a little tension between the Greek tradition of pre-existing chaos. I mentioned this last time, whether you want to see this in the myths of Hesiod, who sees again matter arising or the created order arising out of a pre-existing chaos, or from Ovid's Metamorphoses, which was vastly influential in the medieval period, the most widely read work, I should have thought, on that front. Whereas the Christian belief was that God created the world out of nothing, ex nihilo, which I mentioned last time. But in both cases, and we can see that in Plato's account, the cosmos is perfect, finite, and it's spherical, enclosing within itself a number of concentric, transparent spheres. Let me put one of those up on the screen here. Let me give the illustration that I draw upon usually here, this, which I referred to last time. These concentric spheres in which there is no space between them either. They're literally rubbing against each other, grinding, and from which grinding comes the celestial music. But this is a concentric, transparent spheres, each with its own particular motion. And at the center of the cosmos is the stationary earth. At the center of the earth, which we see in Dante's Inferno, for instance, is sometimes placed hell, right down, deep down inside of it. That's how Dante conceives of it at any rate. But the constituent materials of this terrestrial sphere and its inhabitants are the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. The earth and the water being here at the center, and the air being outside that, and then the fire being further still outside of that. Now, these four elements was derived by Plato and Aristotle from the pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles, who also spoke of the way in which these two elements related, or all these elements, namely through love and strife. And that was what accounted for the mutability here. Now, everything in the cosmos is mutable below the realm of, in the sublunary realm, everything below the influence of the moon. Note how the moon waxes and wanes. Note how the moon exerts an influence on the tides of the earth. That realm, which is the earthly realm, is subject to all the things that I said at the outset. It's subject to inconstancy. It's subject to generation and the need for generation. It's subject to corruption, however, also flux and change. And these are seen as malign things. Change is not good. Whereas the heavens above that are seen to be the exact opposite. As I said, they are constant, they are orderly, and they are eternal, and they are transparent spheres. But note that there is a hierarchy, and here the hierarchy is contained outside the created universe in the Caelum Imperium Habitaculum Dei et Omnium Electorum, the kingdom of heaven, the habitation of God and all the elect. This is outside the created universe. This is the Ptolemaic cosmology. As I said, these spheres are concentric, and they move in such a way that the heavenly body embedded in the spheres, whether it's the Lunae, Mercury, Veneris, Solus, Martis, Jovis, or Saturni, the 7 planets in English, the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, or Saturn, these are embedded within these transparent spheres. These move separately, and they're impelled partly by the motion of the sphere outside of it. So they get pushed around and they move in opposite directions. And this results in an influence, this word influenza, from which we get the word flu, which is very interesting etymologically. The word flu is basically inferring that we don't know why we get sick, but it's because effectively of the constellation of the planets. Haven't heard that explanation yet for COVID, but but the influence of the spheres is a hierarchical one. The one at the outside of Saturn is going to have an influence on the one down below, but it doesn't work the other way around, because God is outside of all these things and he moves everything downwards down to the earth. The sublunary realm is particularly influenced by those above it and outside of it. Now, these number of spheres varies in the medieval Renaissance period, but by the time we get to the late Renaissance is generally seen to be 10. The 7 planets going from the Earth to Saturn, and then outside that, the realm of the fixed stars or the firmament, and we can see that where is it, the 8th in the firmament, and then the crystalline sphere outside that, and then finally the 10th heaven, which is the primum mobile, the prime mover that moves all the rest of these. And beyond that, as I say, is God and the realm of the elect. Now, Aristotle's notion of an unmoved mover who moves the cosmos is effectively becomes overtaken by the idea of a Christian God who moves the cosmos through divine love. That's what moves the stars, says Dante, that word stars, which is the last word in each 3 of his canticles. And this friction, and I mentioned this friction briefly, creates music. Now, this music is harmonious and it has a scale. And of course, scales have degrees, higher pitch and lower pitch. Higher pitches of being the most heavenly. So the higher one sings, the more like the celestial angels, who sing in such a way that we cannot hear them. So high are they. Now, the idea of musical theory comes from this notion of cosmology. As I say, of the 7 liberal arts, the 4 that are the quadrivium, astronomy, music, arithmetic, and geometry are these 4, and they're interconnected. Plato, by the way, supposes that 8 sirens, remember the siren song that lured Odysseus and his men to their doom, potentially at any rate? Plato conjectured that there were 8 sirens that sang these 8 different heavenly notes. And these were later identified by the Greek tradition with the 9 muses. But ultimately, and you'll find this most interesting, this this cosmology became adapted by Christians, these were associated with 9 orders of the angels. The 9 orders being the seraphim, the cherubim, the thrones, the dominions, dominations rather, powers, virtues, princedoms, archangels, and angels. And so these 9 orders of the angels and their choirs became associated with both with this Pythagorean, Platonic, celestial harmony, but also with the Aristotelian intelligences. Now, this is a lot to throw at you all at once, but once again, note the hierarchical way and the structured and the orderly way in which this universe is understood. If you want to look into this further, you'll have to go to Boethius and his Principles of Music. I gave a lecture on this when I talked in my Milton class. There are 3 types of music there that correspond to the 3 types of chains of being that I referred to here. So there is the music of the spheres, or the cosmic music, which he calls the musica mundana. We can't hear that, it's inaudible. But there's also a social harmony, the musica humana, that which resides between the king and his subjects. That is a sort of a harmonious, it's probably an analogical presentation, but it's presented in musical terms. This is the musica humana. And finally, it can be associated with what we associate music with, which is the musica instrumenta, constituta, for that matter. So we can actually play the 8 strings, or the 8 notes rather, that will reproduce all of this various hierarchical sort of harmony. And so this correspondence, and I guess I'm giving away some of what I'm going to talk about in the next talk here, between these different types of music and the different levels of the cosmos, illustrates something very important. And that is the relation between the heavenly and the earthly. The heavenly is there to guide the earthly. Music is there to give us a guide to an orderly, structured society. Music is there to give us an orderly, structured guide to how we ought to order our passions, subdue our souls. The reason being the godlike faculty that rules over the passions which tend towards discord and disharmony, being more of the body. So you can see that there. Now, this dualistic cosmos of the heaven and the earth is seen as therefore as a series of gradations moving downwards from the highest form of existence down to the lowest, or depending on how you want to see it. But from God to the angels, to men, to the animals, to the plants, and finally to inanimate things like stones. This is also known as the scala naturae, the ladder of nature, or the chain of being. I'll give you another image in a second on the screen to illustrate this, but it's sometimes symbolized in the writing of the period by Jacob's ladder. If you want to find that in the Bible, Genesis 28, verse 12, and sometimes presented as a golden chain, taking the passage from the Iliad, in which Zeus threatened to hang the earth from Olympus. So this is the Iliad, book 8, lines 18 to 27, presented hanging on a golden chain. You'll see this in a second. In fact, why don't I show you that right now? You can see the golden chain hanging down from God's hand here, and this is nature there. I'll come to this illustration in a second. But the central position in the scale of nature between God, the angels, and so forth is held by mankind, who is a microcosm. Now, his bodily structure, as I said, mirrors the terrestrial sphere. And within his bodily structure, we have something called a doctrine called that of the four humors. And these create a sort of a hierarchy within the human body, for that matter, which comes to explain things that we now attribute to the field of psychology to explain. They have a physiological, almost chemical explanation for where we get different temperaments and so forth. And this is the doctrine of the four humors. I'll just read my own outline here. In the old theory of physiology, dating back to ancient Athens, or rather ancient Greece, from Hippocrates, from whom we get the Hippocratic Oath, there are four chief liquids of the human body. There's blood, there's phlegm, there's yellow bile, and there's black bile. These are called humors. And these are allied to the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water. So blood, like air, is hot and moist. Yellow bile, like the fire, is hot and dry. Phlegm, like water, is cold and moist. And black bile, like the earth, is cold and dry. And diseases and mental illness, mental and moral illnesses, moral dispositions are caused by the condition of the humors, which are caused by the conditions of the planets, etc., etc. And disease results from the dominance of some element within a single humor, or from a lack of balance or proportion among the humors themselves. So humors also will give off vapors that ascend to the brain. So there's a physiological or chemical explanation for why the mind is affected. Modern psychology is really saying very similar things to what we have here. So individual personality, physical attributes, mental health, moral character are explained by their temperament or the state of a person's humor. And I have a little chart there and the characteristics that go with that. But I'm going to finish with a quote from Anthony speaking of Marcus Brutus in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. This, he says, was the noblest Roman of them all. His life was gentle, and the elements so mixed in him that nature might stand up and say to all the world, this was a man. Act 5, Scene 5, line 68 and following. So the four humors are yet another illustration of this hierarchy. The other, which I mentioned at the outset, is that of the soul, which is seen as having a tripartite structure, at least according to Aristotle on the soul. And it represents, again, this scale of nature. There are three different types of souls according to Aristotle. There are vegetative souls, which humans share with plants and animals. And that soul is a tendency, which means that we're capable of growth and reproduction. There is a sensitive soul. Note, these are not discrete things, but there are three different aspects to human nature. There's a sensitive soul, which we share with the animals. Man and the animals share this, and it makes us capable of thought and choice. And then finally, that's the rational. So that the sensitive soul means that we're just capable of sensation. And we share that with the animals. Whereas the rational soul, let me stop there for a second. Oh dear. Sorry for that. Whereas the rational soul is something that we share in common with the angels. And that aspect gives us the capacity for thought and choice. And altogether, seen as a whole, this cosmology is intellectually and also aesthetically satisfying. It accounts for the union of beauty, goodness, and truth, and explains their interrelation and their application in the myriad ways in which there is a chain of being, and this can be seen again in multiple ways in the macrocosm, namely in the book of nature itself, that hierarchy between the sun and the realms and spheres above it, and the earthly, so the heavenly and the earthly, and also in the body politic between the king and the subjects, that social hierarchy where there's a sort of a music as well. And then finally, in the microcosm of the individual, where the reason rules over the passions, and by means of the will. And this then is, as I say, a intellectually and aesthetically satisfying way of seeing things, and it's characteristic of this period. And it has both religious and moral significance. The position of humanity, man, is at the center of the universe, and it is paradoxical. On the one hand, we are imperfect and we are bound to the earth. We are unhappily aware of the fact that we reside on the earth and we are not in the heavenly sphere of existence. On the other hand, we also know that, because in Genesis it says this, that God has created the cosmos for us. And through a proper exercise of the reason, the celestial faculty, the one to whose degree we should bow, we are capable of aspiring towards the heavens. And so the religious and moral significance supported this belief in the traditional cosmology, and the church thereby invested a great deal of significance to it. And it failed in the end, I said this last time, only because the observed facts brought about by Nicholas Copernicus and eventually other astronomers like Galileo simply made it appear to be nothing other than a poetic myth. Now, the fact that the new philosophy, the new science, the new cosmology introduced problems with this rational, orderly, moral, and aesthetically beautiful system that connected the seven liberal arts into a seamless, interconnected garment in which there was a great deal of stagecraft and beauty being represented there, created all manner of issues with cosmology. And there were thereby introduced not only the ideas of Copernicus and modern science. It's easy to see modern science resulting from modern astronomy. It doesn't quite work so easily and smoothly as all that. But there are alternatives to the Ptolemaic view, which is a sort of a fusion, as I say, of Aristotle and Plato, which depended on reason. There are other ways of seeing cosmology that have been there since the ancient Greek world. And I'll stick one up here, which I think I've put up here before. Yes. And this is from the engraver Robert Flood, and the Latin at the top. This is the mirror of the whole of nature and the image of art. And you might find this interesting for those of you who've done literary theory with me about mimesis and holding a mirror up to nature, a quote that's from Shakespeare's Hamlet. Here we have the tetragrammaton, as I say, Jehovah here, or Yahweh in modern renderings, holding, you see a little hand, a golden chain down. And what is he holding? Well, he's holding a woman. Well, let me describe this. This is for the description. And this, I say that the old cosmology was associated with rationalism and reason. We tend to associate modern science with that very thing, with rationality and reason. What we have trouble then explaining is irrationality and occultism. And occultism and irrationality and the devotion to magic is something that arises in this period. It's not to be found in the medieval period. It is to be found in the Renaissance period. C.S. Lewis, in his work, his Introduction to 16th Century Literature, says that although people tend to associate the Middle Ages with all manner of weird and wonderful hocus pocus, this was an intensely rational age, and he finds no evidence of devotion to magic. On the contrary, he thinks that it's not to be found at all. It appears rather in the 16th century, at the very time when the new cosmology is being introduced, and it particularly takes off in the 17th century. So exactly concurrent with the rise of a new cosmology and a new science. And with that comes, as I say, different understandings of the cosmos as rendered here by the flood picture. And let me go back to that, stick it on the screen for you here. Let me share this screen. So this is Robert Flood's description, which I've already read to you, but let me read Wayne Shoemaker's description of this. And he does this in his Occult Sciences in the Renaissance. So as moving away from rationalism, we see a rise of interest in the occult, in the interest in things like Kabbalah, in interest in Hermetic things and very bizarre Rosicrucian philosophies and so forth. These outer three circles in Flood's picture contain various symbols. They represent the cherubim, the seraphim, and the archangels. And these surround the order of the fixed stars. That's the outermost blue here. The spheres of the planets, you can see these still here, and two additional spheres of the fire and air going on down there. Now at the top, we can see God's hand holding a chain which descends to the figure of a nude virgin who represents nature. And she's portrayed with starry hair, lest we think that she is some sort of pagan goddess. And from her left hand, in turn, the chain descends that to an ape. Now the ape is not some sort of proto-Darwinian appeal to the ape being a sort of the forerunner to humanity. Rather, it is a representation of art as imitation or aping. And it symbols what art is understood to be at this time. It is mimicking or mirroring, and it ought to mirror what is above us rather than what is below us, but it is aping. And in the ape, as I say, the symbol for art, along the chain of God, God's powers and effects are transmitted downwards. Nature guides the primum mobile on the outside, pushes it around and turns the fixed stars and influences, and through their influences, it passes on down to material substances. And the planets act as marculi, little hammers, to produce earthly metals. And though pictured on one of her breasts, the sun is at nature's heart, at the center of this. And her belly is filled with the moon. And also we can see that life and vitality of the elemental creatures come from this breast. So this lady represents all sorts of things that are not really associated with the woman per se, but rather with the whole of the natural world order. Now, the earth under her right foot stands for sulfur, the water under her left foot for mercury. And the joining of these through her body symbolizes their union in whatever is generated or grows. Note that both of them are combustible and highly mutable. Now, art is born from man's talents and helps nature by means of secrets learned from diligent observation of her ways. And then there are 7 little circles here, these represent animals, vegetables, minerals, the more liberal arts, etc., etc. Let me leave off with that, but that's sufficient to illustrate how the old cosmology, which was rational and orderly, gives way to new cosmologies, which tend towards materialism and irrationalism, materialism being entirely incompatible with a rational explanation of things. And it will harken back to some views like that of Lucretius and his nature of the universe. By the way, Lucretius's the nature of the universe was rediscovered in 1417. It was not known in the medieval period. And it influences Giordano Bruno, one of the cosmologists of the day. And he proposes the idea of an infinite universe, going back to Aristotle again. And we get then new cosmologies that are not only different and not only tending towards irrationalism, but and not only tending towards paganism, but in many ways are at total enmity with all of the orderly presentation that we'd seen before. So that is the great chain of being in a brief lecture, and what becomes of it as the cosmology shifts. I'll see you next time when I come to talk about the set of correspondences. Thank you.